We should be live? Okay. Hello, friends. Today we are talking about sex, drugs, and with an option of rock and roll. But I think the first two should suffice. I'd like to introduce you to today's guest, Rebecca Coffey. Rebecca is a science journalist with broad national recognition. She contributes 5 features a month to Forbes.com, where she addresses evolution, science, health, and behavior. She has written regularly for Scientific American and Discover magazines, PsychologyToday.com, and Vermont Public Radio, where she was a frequent on-air contributor for almost a decade. And she has also contributed to science-informed op-eds. I don't even know what that is. Op-eds.
An opinion piece.
Okay.
Opinion editorial.
Okay. Thank you. To newspapers like the New York Daily News, the Chicago Tribune, the Seattle Times, and to many radio and internet outlets. Coffey is also a humorist and can be found on McSweeney's Internet Tendency. This is another hard one to say. Defenestration.
Oh, defenestration.
Defenestration.
Defenestration is from the word fenêtre, which is the French word for window. So when you defenestrate someone, you throw them out the window.
Oh, nice. That's the best way to say it. I love that. It's a new word for me today.
Yeah.
Defenestration. Yeah. Throw them out the window. That's great. The Rumpus is also a cool name. And then as well as other lit websites. So how you put it in your bio. I like that. She is also the author of the highly praised serio-comic hysterical Anna Freud story.
Yeah, it's a novel. It's fact-based, and it's called Hysterical, Anna Freud story, because Anna Freud was Freud's daughter. And because she was a lesbian, her psychiatric diagnosis was hysteria.
Nice.
Yeah. It was a different time.
It's a different time for sure. So without any further ado, Rebecca, welcome. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
I didn't even ask you before we got online how much time you have with you today, but hopefully... just give me a sign if we're going too long.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I think I'm good until my daughter shows up at 11.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. So, welcome. I had 2 options. You gave me 2 options in our chats prior to this interview, and we jumped on psilocybin as a topic. It's an interesting coincidence that our conversation is taking place on Bicycle Day.
Right. Bicycle Day is an annual celebration. Back in 1943, Albert Hofmann, who synthesized both LSD and 10 years later psilocybin, ingested some LSD in 1943, April 19th. And he did it on purpose because he had accidentally scraped some into his skin a few days before and gotten nicely stoned, and that took him by surprise. So he thought, hey, I'll take some.
Yeah.
So he took a huge dose. Yeah. He didn't know
how much
about dosing.
Yeah.
And he started to have a very intense experience, and he asked a lab assistant to help him get home. Well, it was the war, and you couldn't drive, right? There were no cars. And so he got on his bike, and they had a bicycle ride home, and apparently it was an amazing bicycle ride. And the psilocybin, the psychedelic era for the developed world started that day.
Yeah, and he was just on LSD basically. I think I've heard stories of him. He's saying like the story was his bike felt like he was like just going up and down, like the front wheel was just in the clouds kind of.
Okay.
I can just imagine. Yeah, but it's the in this article, I'm not going to read it. It's your article, so I'd be so weird for someone else just to sit here and like read your article. but there's this, so can you just kind of go through it for us? Like what the...
Sure.
Yeah, it was just a fantastic read for me, and it was nice, and I don't know, it took me about 10 or 15 minutes. It's a good read.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've just called it up on my screen so I can remember the flow.
Yeah.
So the big news is that in the United States anyway, the state of Oregon has not only decriminalized all drugs you can have for personal, non-commercial use, any drug you want. You cannot be sent to jail for possession.
Yeah.
But on the same ballot where they enacted that law, they enacted ballot measure 109, which actually called for the institution, the design and institution of a network of what they called psilocybin service centers.
Yeah.
So they're not quite sure yet what psilocybin service centers will do, but they were formed because there's an abundance of evidence showing that psilocybin-assisted mental health therapy can really make a remarkable difference for anxiety, depression, end-of-life concerns, the depression that you might feel as your life is ending because of a cancer diagnosis, exactly. For example, alcoholism, tobacco use. It's one researcher that I spoke to, his name is Peter Hendrickson. He's at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, likened the therapy, the psilocybin-assisted therapy, to the extraordinary experience that Charles Dickens described for one character on Christmas Eve when he visited the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and to come. Yeah. You don't need to visit with those ghosts more than once. They rearrange your perspective. Yeah. So psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy seems to be ripe with potential. And two psychotherapists in Oregon lobbied and got by popular vote, Oregon, which is both a red and a blue state, has decided to institute these centers. And they've now seated an advisory board, and I think they are hoping for 2023 openings.
It's such an interesting, it's so interesting, but at the same time, it seems like sad that it took actually so long, right? That if you're talking, we're talking back, going all the way to 1943 in the original, what happened? Why did it just go off the map? Why did it take
this long?
Yeah, why did it just go off the map? Yeah. And not just psilocybin, right? Like
LSD helps in therapy as well. Yeah. Psychedelics are an assist to mental health therapy. And there's all sorts of studies that were done at places like Harvard. So Harvard was really a leader in the testing of the spiritual, mystical, and psychological effects of psychedelics. But their use also altered the psyches, or let's say the behavior of the people leading the experiments. And they were Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who later became the yogi known as Baba Ram Dass. Yeah. Right? These were really straight, smart guys, eager to learn. And they tuned in and dropped out.
That's exactly that's like famous line, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's what happened to them. And they became more colorful and more filled with antics as they were doing these experiments with the substances that were not at the time prohibited at all. Yeah. But Harvard became distressed because Leary, for example, wasn't meeting with his classes. And there were rumors that he was bullying people into taking psychedelics. I don't know if any of that is true, but those are the grounds that he got fired on. And Alpert got fired for something similar. Yeah. And they went on to lead very colorful lives, right? Yeah. But Leary saw the inside of 36 different prisons eventually, because the federal government started hounding him. They got him for cannabis possession, and they just hounded him. Yeah. And he escaped from jail at one point, fled to Afghanistan, probably ended up, everywhere he fled, he ended up in jail. Yeah. So that put a damper on their reputation. Yeah. Meanwhile, psychedelics became the darling of the anti-war movement. And conservatives across the country hated the anti-war movement. The LBJ era was very, very difficult for the counterculture. And so by the end of the 60s and the early 70s, those substances were banned not only federally in the United States, but by international treaty among, I think, 183 countries.
Yeah.
You couldn't get that stuff anywhere except from your local dealers on the street corner.
Yeah. There you have it.
But studies were shut down.
And yeah, and so then all of these positive things, like being able to actually study it and use it for good, and not just for having this party atmosphere or this.
Right.
It just became politicized, and then it went off the map for. And I know Colorado, right? Colorado kind of has been leading this lately, like the last 5 or 6 years. It seems like Colorado was they legalized psilocybin last year before, right? Or
I'm not even sure. I do remember that they legalized cannabis because the child of a friend of mine runs a cannabis farm, legal cannabis farm in Colorado. Yeah. They can't, it's interesting, do business with banks. So they can't accept credit cards. They put their money in a safe deposit box because it's still illegal federally.
Yeah, that's a weird thing, right? Yeah. I'm originally from California. I've been living in Germany for 13 years, but I went back to visit my family in 2019, I have to think, because obviously last year was out. And we rented a house and we went out there and I knew that it was legalized in California too. So I just, out of curiosity, had to go down there and see what the story was. Yeah. And my family, my father, my stepfather, and my mother were both California Highway Patrol officers. They're cops basically. They don't like to be called cops, but they were officers of the law. And I grew up in this household where you had this tension as a teenager, trying to maybe sneak out and smoke a little pot, and then we had so many stresses. And then here I'm able to purchase it and then sit there on the porch of this house and smoke a joint legally. And I looked at my father-in-law, my stepfather, and just say, what did we fight about all these years? What was that all about? And he's just like, yeah. He's like, yeah, I get it, man. It's no big deal. But it was part of his moral. It had, and I understand. And so it just feels like so much wasted energy. And how many people were still incarcerated because of
possession and because of selling small amounts of it. And of course it's mostly the people of color who got imprisoned and the people with white skin who didn't. Yeah. So it is an extraordinary injustice that there are people still in jail over this.
And that's great. So in Oregon, it's not only like, that's true, that I read that the bigger, more wide, more interesting, not even interesting, but just a more broad opening as of 2021, small possession, all these minor things are gone. Like you can carry, but but it can't be like these Schedule 1 substances, like I guess what's Schedule 1, right? You have heroin, everything, right?
Cocaine, things that
even things that maybe we think like, well, it's not so great, right?
But better to have them legal so that people can go and say, I need treatment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because making it illegal turns it into this whole other...
It's such a risk to ask for help.
Yeah, it's such a risk to ask for help. It's an interesting way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah. And so these studies that have been done, at first in the 60s, and then they began again in 2006. The way I write it in the article is that some intrepid researchers waded into the breach. And with the help of an organization called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, I think that's the long name, the acronym is M.A.P.S.
Okay.
Universities and hospitals get federal approval to work with controlled substances. And so they've done studies since 2006 that have consistently shown a beneficial effect when they are given in a supportive setting and are part of mental health therapy. But all of those studies are small number studies. They're called small n studies. So that it's sometimes difficult to tell if the results are really just a function of chance. But in order to get population-sized studies, you'd have to give these drugs to a population of 40,000 people or so. Nobody's going to do that right now. So some researchers have turned to other people's databases and looked at associations. Peter Hendricks from the University of Alabama at Birmingham is one of those people. And he's several times been parts of studies that grabbed hunks of people, like 119 people, 1,000 people, 119,000 people, 48,000 people.
Hundreds of thousands.
And they looked at associations. What is the association between psychedelic use, specifically psilocybin use, and criminality? It seems to lower criminality, not raise it. The other drugs are associated with a boost in criminality. So what he looked at was lifetime use of the drug and past year behaviors. And psilocybin especially seems associated with a reduction in criminality, a reduction in depression and anxiety, and improved general health benefits. And psilocybin is not addictive.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to overdose on. You might have a terrible experience, but you're not going to die easily overdosing on psilocybin.
Yeah. You might feel like you're going to die, but that's
that's right. That's right. In fact, I have another article coming out later this afternoon in which I interviewed a wonderful retired minister in Honolulu. His name is Mike Young. And he was one of the subjects of an experiment conducted in Timothy Leary's lab in 1962. How cool. And it was a fairly carefully structured experiment. That organization M.A.P.S, the Multidisciplinary Association of, I can't even remember the name that I just gave it. They've declared it one of the few legitimately scientific studies of the effect of psilocybin, and he was one of those guys.
Did he talk about his experience? Yeah.
And he told me about his experience. And it was a double-blind study. They separated them into two groups, placebo and drug. Nobody knew if they'd taken the placebo or the drug, and the experimenters didn't know which one they'd given because they weren't handed mushrooms; they were handed pills.
Yeah, okay.
Everybody had a pill that looked pretty much the same. And one person, and then it's called the Good Friday experiment because they had to listen to a Good Friday service, and they were supposedly measuring people's any spiritual or mystical experiences that you had.
And he was the one. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
He was one of them.
Yeah.
One of the guys listened to the sermon and became convinced that he had been personally appointed to announce to the world that though Jesus was dying on Good Friday, he would soon rise again. And so he bolted from the room and ran out to Commonwealth Avenue in Boston and started going into buildings to tell people that Jesus would rise again. So he had to be tackled and injected with Thorazine. Yeah. As it turns out, that guy had the placebo. The placebo was vitamin B.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mike Young, on the other hand, had the actual drug. And it was a first-time experience for him. And he, too, had a very difficult period of anxiety in which he felt like he was swimming in an ocean that was full of colors. And he had to grab onto a color and rise out of the ocean or he would die. And he couldn't decide which color to grab a hold of. And so he started to die. And that was a terrifying experience for him. But then it went away, and he had a wonderful time. He was a divinity student. All of the subjects were divinity students, but he was a divinity student with what now, 51 years later or so, he thinks, was not all that admirable a quest. He wanted to be a divinity student and a doctor and a lawyer, which means he wanted to become some kind of really smart saint,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
But he walked away from that experience with a complete reframing of his life that kind of occurred to him over the next year. And he spent the next 51 years doing social activism and social work.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
for him, he can almost mark that experience as a change in his direction in his life.
Yeah, he said it reframed his life for him.
Yeah.
And what he had thought people meant by an increase of spiritual experience was that he would hear the statue of the Virgin Mary talk or something like that. He was focused on icons of religion when what was going to happen to him was a spiritual change.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think that's why a lot of people, if you haven't experienced it before, you hear this, you think to yourself, "Well, I'm afraid of that because what if I take this drug and I have this experience and then I come out of it and I change everything in my life and I don't know. I mean, just hearing that sounds like you don't want, maybe everything's good how it is. I don't want to ruin what I've got going. What if I go in there and so you have respect for that, or you're afraid of opening yourself up for changing things, maybe even for the worst as an outsider, or
Right.
I don't know.
I have carefully constructed my life. We all have. And it's as though we are making a mosaic, a complicated mosaic of stones in a pan, and it's finally get to the point where it's kind of colorful and looks just like you want, and then you're just going to toss the thing up and let them come back down in the pan.
Let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I read in your article too that the quest is going to be tricky because of the amount of effort it takes to have a useful session. Like it takes a lot of manpower, right? So if you're going through and I'm coming into my psilocybin therapy, then they're going to plan 6 to 8 hours of therapy session just for one person, right?
Right, and they're going to probably meet with you before it, and then do a 6 to 8 hour session, and then meet with you after. That's intensive, expensive time for the therapist. But look at it the other way. You're going to go to therapy once a week for 20 years, or are you going to concentrate it like that? And as it was Peter Hendricks who gave me the analogy, you only need to talk to the spirits of Christmas once.
Mm-hmm.
So it may be a very cost-effective way to deliver therapy, especially for substance abuse, for anxiety, for depression, for suicidal thoughts, for PTSD, for end-of-life anxieties. It may be enormously helpful. Now, one of the ways that they test drugs in human populations is to do a double-blind study. You either get the drug or the placebo, and you don't know which. That may not work. Hendricks bridled a bit when I said, wait, that's not going to work. Either you are stoned out of your mind or you are not.
Yeah.
And so and if you are stoned out of your mind, you're going to be spending 6 amazing hours,
hopefully,
with a therapist in a room.
Yeah.
And if you've taken the placebo, you will be bored to smithereens. There is no such thing as a double-blind study.
Yeah.
He didn't agree with that at all. I don't know what he was planning on giving people as a placebo, but placebos are supposed to be absolutely nothing pills.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So exactly. So maybe he's thinking not like a placebo, but it's going to be something else, but it won't be psilocybin or something like that. So they're not just
right. So
I
think what happened in the study in 1962 on Good Friday was that the guy who had to be injected with Thorazine had taken niacin, which is one of the components of vitamin B. And
it just gave him a lot of energy, right?
It causes you to flush. You have a facial flush. You have an increase in body temperature. And he keyed into that.
Yeah.
And got very anxious. Ideally, a placebo does nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that is going to be part of the problem of testing the drug.
What have you done any research into microdosing?
I'm about to read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind.
Yeah, I haven't read that either. I wanted to check
Yeah,
that out.
I haven't,
How
and
to
I
change
haven't
your
done
mind.
any microdosing. And, I'm 67 years old. I'm cautious about changes to myself physiologically, but I'm very intrigued. There's new research out showing that for the antidepressant effect of psilocybin, you don't need to go all the way to the psychedelic stage. Microdoses help. Microdoses do it. There must be something in psilocybin that on a biological level affects perhaps there's the serotonin levels in your brain
Yeah.
and acts just in the way any good antidepressant does or any good serotonin SSRI
Yeah, well, yeah.
does.
So these SSRIs are something that I totally missed the boat on. I'm probably, but I've heard about them. I've heard about like, so these SSRIs. What are some of the names of those? I don't even know.
Prozac and
Proac. Yeah.
Zoloft.
Yeah.
And,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So those are the most popular, I think. So
Yeah.
it has an effect on serotonin levels, and that may be enough,
Yeah.
but that wouldn't be enough for a single dose life change.
Right. So the Terrence McKenna always talked about this. What do they call it? This hero dosage, and I think it's something like 25 grams or something like that, which is just
Milligrams, probably. 25 grams would.
yeah,
25 grams, imagine how big that is.
it's a lot.
That's a lot. You want to.
But milligrams is 2.5 grams, right? So
No, a milligram would be a millionth of a gram.
yeah,
Sorry, a thousandth of a gram.
Yeah.
A thousandth of a gram.
yeah. I'm pretty sure that's like a whole bag of mushrooms, right? Like 25 grams. I don't know. I'd have to look it up again. But I remember
Yeah, it would be a bad. It would be a way too. It would be a very uncomfortable dose.
he kind of made it sound like in his book it made it sound like it was like a semi truck racing down a slopey like an icy slope, like a mountain.
Interesting. Okay.
And you can't. Yeah, yeah,
crashing into your head.
yeah, and he's basically saying like you can't press the brakes. So like if every time you try and like you have to just go full with it, and that's the problem I think when you're on these trips and you try and stop yourself or slow yourself down, that's when problem hits. So it's kind of, but taking that dosage is you're in it to win it. There's no coming out of that until you've gotten this poison out of you, right?
So there is. One time this was the middle 70s, and I was living on the Panhandle in the Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco.
Yeah.
And I was just out one day running errands, and a guy came up to me and said, excuse me, I need help. Can you help me? And I said, sure, what's happened? And he said, I've taken way too much LSD, and I'm very freaked out. And I said, no problem. And I took him by the hand and walked him to the liquor store. And we bought a magnum of white wine. And it wasn't very good because I was, 25 years old or so. I couldn't afford more than a $4 bottle of wine.
Yeah.
We went back to the park and sat down, and I said, your job is to drink this.
Why?
Now, you don't have to finish the bottle, but you have to drink as much of it as you can, because that's just going to bring you down.
Yeah.
And we sat on that bench while he drank it, and we were there for a couple of hours, and finally he was fine.
So the alcohol just slowed his system down.
It did to him at a slower pace what Thorazine had done for the guy at the Good Friday experiment when he thought that he was personally appointed to announce the coming of the rising of the Lord.
See, and when you were telling that story, I was like, that was definitely a guy on mushrooms, but that was so funny that it turned out to not be that guy.
Right. And in the stats, they compiled the number of people who had had religious experiences. And he counted as one because his had something to do with Jesus.
Yeah.
And the Unitarian minister, now retired, Mike Young, who actually had a spiritual experience, counted as one who didn't, because he was like, I didn't hear any voices. The statues didn't speak to me. There were no hymns being sung in my ear.
Yeah.
So it was, nobody knew what they'd been through.
One of the best ones I've heard. I love listening to these stories too, because I listen to them like as an audiobook. Sometimes I'll listen to an interview, and I listened into one from Paul Stamets. Is that how I say his name right? Stamets, yeah. He did a great TED Talk also, and he was talking to Joe Rogan about his experiences, one of his psilocybin experiences out in the forest, and he climbed up a tree basically, and he watched the storm come in, and it seems funny. It's also what you wrote here is that some of it's actually in the article that you showed me that right before we got online, your article that came out today, that you have like this you have this experience that's eye-opening and it's very prolific, but as an outsider and in these, how did that go? They didn't experiment with people taking psilocybin. It appear to themselves that they're very creative in the moment while they're stoned. But what happens is it
was a assessment of the effect of psilocybin on creativity.
Yeah.
And they gave them, I loved this experience.
Yeah, it was fantastic. A little read.
They gave them a few tasks that, first of all, they thought, what is creativity? How do we measure it? And they said, well, there's convergent thinking where you're always looking for the right answer.
Okay.
And there's divergent thinking where you're kind of like, well, anything's going to be helpful. Let's think about this idea and this idea and this idea.
Okay.
So they gave them some tasks where they had to come up with the right answer, and they had to come up with many possible answers. And people on psilocybin scored more poorly on both tasks.
Yeah.
But in self-assessments, they thought they had scored really well, right? That they'd been highly creative, and it was a profound experience.
Yeah.
So what that showed was that psilocybin decreases your productive creativity. They couldn't complete tasks in a helpful way. Their executive functioning was gone. Lots of stuff was gone. They were distractible. Yeah. But they thought they were geniuses.
Yeah.
And then 7 days later, they had them do the same tests. And the deficits caused by psilocybin were not as profound. They scored almost as well as the placebo group on task completion at that point, and a little bit better on naming novel approaches to problem solving. So I think, frankly, that the researchers were astonished, because that was not what they had predicted.
Yeah.
But they said, but look, there's two ways to look at this. One is that psilocybin essentially stupefies you and lies about it. But another way is to say that psilocybin doesn't help with productive creativity, but it does give you insights. And maybe the increase in insight is why it is so helpful in psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy.
I've been reading about this company here in the Netherlands that have what they do is they offer a microdosing service, and it's legal there. So they, but because of the pandemic right now, it's just they're doing also like remote consultations. So they'll send you like a package of psilocybin, mushrooms basically, but they're I don't know. I'm sure they're good, right? Because it's all professional, and it's
pharmaceutical dose.
A pharmaceutical, it's something that's not just straight out of the garden, or it is. It's just a nice garden.
Or it might be synthesized. It might be synthesized. Yeah, maybe it could be become in a synthesized form, but because they need to standardize
the effects,
the dose.
the dosage.
So, my mushrooms that I grow in my laundry room, which I don't have a laundry room, but mushrooms that I might grow in my laundry room might be less strong than the ones you grow in your closet.
Yeah, and so taking 3 grams or whatever it might be different, and they have to be able to. But they offer a service, and they also offer a protocol. So the protocol was interesting. I was reading this online, and they have like a PDF where it's a therapeutic approach where you analyze what's something that you want to change in your life and write a journal throughout a 30-day process. And you're supposed to find your dosage, what kind of hits you at like where you feel the effects, and then you're supposed to back off 0.1 grams from that so that you don't feel the psychoactive part of the psilocybin, but you have the benefits, probably like we said about the serotonin and the different receptors that are being activated. And you're supposed to do that 1 day on, 1 day off, and you're not supposed to take any no caffeine, no alcohol. That's part of the protocol. And get sleep and meditate. I mean, all these things without psilocybin are beneficial things to begin with, right?
You're living a clean, good, happy, healthy life.
And then they're just adding that psilocybin to it to kind of, I don't know. It's just an interesting aspect of it, and I know that it's working there. It'd be interesting to see how that process could help. I don't know. Just the main thing is, it's like if you're dealing with issues and you have all these, PTSD, coming home from the war or something like that, and you need to work through issues, and sometimes I understand it so that like a psychedelic can help the person actually that's trying to help you. It reveals parts to them that they wouldn't otherwise been able to get to.
Insight.
Yeah.
It gives you insight, and it reframes your life, which was what Mike Young, the guy who was in the 1962 experiment, called it. He said it did not give me what I thought would be a classical mystical experience. It did reframe my life and throw me into useful spirituality.
Put him, and that's kind of what they said too. They said something about like in this protocol that the reason that you don't drink coffee because caffeine changes your frequency. And
maybe that's why I like it.
Yeah, I mean, I do too. I've been always a big fan of coffee, and I like having that extra pep. But my wife has brought that up before too. That it actually, when you take caffeine, it changes our heart frequency. Otherwise, before, if you measure the frequency of our bodies and our hearts, it seems kind of seems like a mystical thing to say, but it's measurable, the frequency of your heart, right? And it has the same frequency as the earth, which is,
that's interesting.
Yeah, but when you drink caffeine, then that goes.
Then that upsets that.
It changes. You're just not in sync with it, and I think that's kind of the reason why in this protocol they wanted you to stay away from caffeine, because they want you to kind of have this like you said, this reordering. This, you want to be able to be open to. It just brought me to something, and I this is the video that I wanted to show you if you don't mind. It's a video of talking about. This stoned ape theory, because in the other article, this is just kind of just to bring back the other article that we didn't choose for our conversation was about the human ape, right? And I thought that was also a very interesting take and a very open take, especially as a woman in this PC world that we live in these days. The way that you really made a very fair judgment of a male's debauchery,
Well, we are animals, women too, and to expect everyone to never behave sexually is ridiculous, because we've been animals for tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, and we've been humans for about 100,000.
Exactly. And that's going to be a cool segue, because if you don't mind, I would love to kind of pick your brain on that article after this video.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so you ready to roll, Eric? All right.
Read any Terence McKenna? I know you're familiar with something called the stoned ape theory. No,
sorry, not.
McKenna. He was an ethnobotanist, and he was also a psychedelic adventurer, and he had a theory, and the theory was that what you're talking about, this climate change, that also coincided with the doubling of the human brain size, his theory was that one of the things that was in play was that these apes would experiment with different food sources as they moved into the grasslands. And there was a lot of ungulates in these grasslands, and that psilocybin mushrooms, which we know existed back then, would grow in these grasslands. And that these monkeys, these apes rather, started consuming psilocybin mushrooms, and it led them to be more creative, and it also led to specific traits like the development of language. That eating mushrooms in low doses increases visual acuity, which would lead them to be better hunters or more perceptive. It also leads them to be hornier, which would most likely involve more breeding, more sexual activity, and possibly select the ones that chose the mushrooms would maybe possibly breed more than the ones that didn't choose the mushrooms, because they were more into it, they were more social, more sexually active. And he has a series of his brother Dennis, who's still alive, detailed it on a podcast we did, the very first podcast we did. His brother is an actual scientist, and detailed it in terms of how psilocybin affects the brain and what areas of the brain what actually takes place when you're under the influence of this, and that it could very potentially have led to the development of language, and that all these things in play, the throwing arm, the developing these new social networks where you need to communicate with each other, along with the harnessing of fire, along with the consumption of psychedelic mushrooms on a regular basis, because they were incredibly frequent and very edible.
All right, that's total trip. I've never heard of that before.
That was a great interview with this guy. What's his name? William von Hippel. And I was just thinking about what a coincidence that those two articles are so close to each other too, and that maybe you have this psilocybin as a way of bringing us out of the Stone Age, in some sense that they could. It was definitely around. The mushrooms were around back then, and the effects.
Do we know that? How do we know that the mushrooms were around back then? That was the only point of that thing that raised my eyebrows. How do we know the mushrooms were there?
Okay, yeah, there has to be some evidence to that. I can't. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
It's true that he's talking about a period probably around. Well, he talked about the acceleration in brain and skull size. That happened 1.8 million years ago.
Okay.
And certainly no biological tissue has survived from that time.
Correct.
Now, if he's talking about the development of language, that happened probably somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, more like 70,000. And I think I'm remembering biologist Helen Fisher's research. She's at the Kinsey Institute. And she talked about the Broca's area of the brain, which is kind of near the motor complex I think it's on the left side of the brain. It flowered. And that is where language is centered. Mm-hmm. And it could certainly be that a substance, an ingested substance, enabled that flowering, but it's not easy to talk about. Well, I would just need to give that more thought. If it enabled the flowering, then that would be a DNA change that would be passed on to generations. So that could make sense. Yeah. What I'm fascinated with in that time period is that when skulls got really big, those babies probably did not make it through the birth canal.
Because they weren't ready. The birth canal wasn't ready yet.
The birth canal wasn't ready. So you would have had a huge die-off of mothers and children.
Yeah. And
the population would have shifted. And again, this is speculation. What I liked about what we just saw was that it was speculation. Speculation is so much fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's probably why I like watching that show.
You have to try to find the places where you can anchor it.
Yeah, true.
But I'm speculating that there was a huge die-off, and that the women who survived were the ones who were genetically incompetent to carry babies to term. So they would have very young babies. And the community, babies are now a precious commodity, a scarce commodity. The community would have supported them. The mates who were probably tasked with bringing them food and protecting them from beasts might have stayed around more, because those babies couldn't be carried, couldn't be let down. They had to be carried around. They had to be kept warm. They had to be fed. So that might have created bonding between sexual partners that wasn't necessarily there before. Mm-hmm. And eventually what we may have come up with is the family unit and romantic love. You know, when I was in college, we were told that romantic love was an artifact of Western culture, that it never existed until the Middle Ages, when court culture introduced flowery language and chivalry. And aside from that, it never existed. Meanwhile, all sorts of anthropological information has been collected into a database that resides at Yale University. And a researcher, I think he was from the University of Nebraska at Las Vegas, examined that database. And he found evidence of romantic love in somewhere around 90% of all cultures, including primitive cultures. And his data was partly refined by the fact that he didn't just look at everybody else's numbers. He called whatever researchers were left alive. Mm-hmm. And even if they said, nope, there was no romance in that culture, he would say, was there suicide? Yeah, sure, there was suicide. Well, give me an example of suicide. Well, a guy hung himself from a tree. Why did he hang himself from a tree? Well, a woman rejected him. And his attitude was, you don't do that over sex.
Yeah.
You don't take your life because you've been sexually refused.
Yeah.
You take your life when the woman you love does not love you. That is evidence of romantic love.
Yeah. And so
romantic love is very universal. We didn't make it up a few hundred years ago. And where did it come from? It may have come indirectly from large skulls.
Indirectly from large skull. I can see that. I can trace that back. That seems... I could follow that whole sequence. The interesting thing to me was how you made the case here for the human ape. How you explained. As I was reading it, I kind of had this feeling of like you had different. What are they called? They have. This is like so learning for me. So you have apes, and then you have the great apes, and the bonobos, right? And then. Yeah. And then the orangutans?
Yes. So wait, let me just jump back a sec.
Please do.
I do want to go through that lineage. The Broca's area of the brain, which I mentioned, developed somewhere between 150,000 years ago, is where language is centered. And with language came gossip, imagination, humor, probably enhanced memories. You could remember a conversation. You could remember a promise. You could talk to your mate quietly at night while the exquisitely vulnerable baby slept. I think that period is where romantic love probably started. Now let's talk about apes.
Yeah,
so
please do.
Humans are great apes. We are great apes. No archaeologist or anthropologist or animal scientist would argue with that at all. Yeah. And if you want a quick lesson on the difference between a great ape and a monkey, monkeys have tails.
That's it.
That's how you can tell the difference. So I believe that the first, we all have a common ancestor. The first species, I think, was gorillas. Gorillas live in harems. The awful truth of a female gorilla's life, she lives with about two or three sister wives. And the awful truth of her life is that if another male wants her, he comes in and he kills her baby before her eyes. And she tries like hell to defend that baby. She is fighting for that baby's life and hers. And he wins always, and he kills the baby. And then she runs off with him and becomes his mate, because she realizes that as a not terribly good fighter and a smaller beast than the men, she needs to be protected by the biggest, baddest gorilla around, and that guy is it. And if she goes and becomes his wife or mate, that will never happen to one of her children again, because they will be his children and he will protect them.
Yeah.
And then orangutans emerged as a species. Orangutans have lots of incidents of what anthropologists have called rape. Lots, right? And rape is an arguable term for a non-human species, that you could just say, well, no, that's how they do sex. Mm-hmm. But they also have, and here we go, with a phrase that should be a book title. They also have languorous oral sex in trees.
Yeah.
So that there is a really sexual and enjoyable part of their lives, but there's also a lot of brutality. And then the next species to separate were humans and pans. We have a common ancestors. Pans are chimpanzees and bonobos. They look almost exactly alike. Bonobos only live in the Congo. They're endangered. But we speciated. Chimps, when a female chimp goes into estrus, she may have 30 sexual encounters a day with different chimps all the time, different males. It's not a romantic thing. It's a slam bam, thank you, ma'am. Bonobos have sex all the time with anybody they can find. So they have heterosexual sex, they have homosexual sex, they have sex with their children. Yeah. They say hello by having sex, they apologize by having sex. Sex is just what they do. It doesn't last very long, it's about 10 seconds, but that's what they do.
Yeah.
That's how mating goes for them. And then there's us.
Yeah.
And, you know, chimps and bonobos look almost identical. And well, we're assuming because we look at bones, but they haven't evolved much since they stayed in the jungle, and they live in a fruit environment, and the fruit is abundant. There was nothing motivating change. Charles Darwin says that species evolve when the environment pressures them to. It's always an adaptation to an environmental pressure. Humans left the jungle probably during a drought and started eating tubers. And as various environments stopped serving them, they would move on, not as an entire group, but as in smaller groups. And because they kept wandering, they kept evolving. We look nothing like we did 6.5 million years ago. Chimps and bonobos do.
Yeah.
And our abilities have far outstripped theirs. Still, we are animals. So in this debate about what male sexual behavior is appropriate or inappropriate, and what female sexual behavior is appropriate or inappropriate, I think it's important to learn that the way we behave has been molded over millions of years by the preferences of the other gender, right? Male peacocks wouldn't have peacock feathers like they do unless the females liked it. Yeah. And men wouldn't have the swagger that many men have unless somewhere along the line females responded well to it. And females, the male directive, what they have to do is spread their seed wildly. Doesn't matter who gets it. There is so much semen and so much sperm in a dose of semen. Yeah. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Something is going to survive. Your gametes are going to go into the next generation.
Yeah.
Females have to bear and raise the children. Their directive is to be choosy as all get out.
Yeah.
So males have evolved to deal with picky females, and females have evolved to deal with indiscriminate males. And that's just a fact of the matter. We've evolved brains and consciousness and culture and sensitivity and empathy. Use it on each other.
Yeah.
But
I was just thinking about it myself. Like, there was some point as an adult male where you just kind of, like, at least I just kind of, I wanted to settle down. Like, I made the decision, you know, but it was a conscious decision.
Yeah.
But I see guys and friends, and you know, they don't make that decision.
It's not the inclination of
Yeah.
most young men. It's just not.
Yeah.
They there's something hormonal going on that they want to have sex at every opportunity. And yes, it is a biological dictate that makes them want to spread their seed. These days, when young men get dressed up to go to a bar, they are probably not hoping to impregnate anybody, right?
Yeah.
That's not what they have in mind.
Yeah.
But what they feel are sexual urges.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps the species alive. We can't legislate sexual behavior away, but we can hold each other responsible for our inappropriate sexual behavior because we are evolved great apes.
Yeah. Yeah. It just takes an extra, it takes a lot of energy, especially depending, like I always have that picture of Bill Clinton, you know, he's a busy guy. And then it was almost like, well, of course, give the guy a break. Of course, like, you know, he needed to just get things. Just part of business was like, who's the closest female here, you know?
Yeah, JFK was the same way.
Yeah.
There was, I can't remember where I just read this description of him, but he jumped into a swimming pool, and there was a woman he didn't know, a young, pretty woman, sitting on the side of the pool, and he just walked over to her and took her in his arms, and they had sex. You know,
it's JFK. You know, yeah, it's interesting. I didn't really I didn't know. I'm out of the loop of the United States, the U.S. I guess you would say what's new and what's happening, and that Matt Lauer was now has been was outed.
He's over.
Yeah,
he's over.
But you wrote it interesting there too, that you said like, well, maybe he shouldn't have his entire legacy ruined. You know, I mean, it's like I don't follow it all. I didn't follow it all what happened and how it all came out. But it's almost like that's an interesting perspective that you had. That you said he needs to be responsible. It doesn't take away from any of his responsibility, and that he should, you know, be responsible for his actions, but at the same time, like, you kind of made it the point at the end, like, maybe there is a limit where you should stop and understand that we're just.
The man who I was particularly wanting to forgive was Al Franken, who was a senator. He used to be on Saturday Night Live, and then he became a senator from Minnesota, and he was an advocate of women's rights, of LGBTQ rights. He was a wonderful progressive. And he was caught for a photo and some behavior that he did back when that kind of behavior was more widely accepted.
Yeah.
And so I would have liked to have seen the guy scolded. I would have liked to. He did give a rather fulsome apology.
Yeah.
But I need Al Franken back. He was fighting the good fight. And he was not just his clumsy and perhaps arrogant and clueless sexual behavior. We all learn, and Al Franken seemed to have learned.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so I was mixing up the guys. So it was Al Franken that you wanted to.
Yeah, Matt Lauer, they can have him.
Yeah. Okay, cool. What about Woody Allen? What happened?
That's an active thing, but that's something that depends on memory, and
depends on memory, which is tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, memory is very tricky. I have no doubt that Dylan believes what she says.
Yeah.
I have some doubt that Woody Allen believes what he says. What I do know is that every accusation is not credible, and neither is every denial. And the difficult part for the rest of us is to understand that there is no historical truth to be had here. We will never know what happened.
Yeah.
But we do have to look at ourselves, because listening to these stories is very difficult. And I don't want to hear that some 7-year-old girl was molested casually by her father.
Yeah.
And so my tendency, self-defensive tendency, is to say she's lying.
Yeah.
That's because I don't want to think that that happens to 7-year-old girls.
Yeah.
I don't want to know how vulnerable we all are. I don't want to know that the sword of Damocles is hanging over all of our heads. So as a society, we tend to side with the perpetrator. Is Woody Allen the perpetrator in this case? I don't know. I find it fascinating, but I am not at a point where I can say that I know what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, it was just something that hit me so weird, because I just remember all of his movies having some type of like these movies always had something about that in there, right? There was always
Manhattan. I remember watching Manhattan way back when Manhattan was new and thinking, what?
Yeah.
This is supposed to be funny that he's with this girl.
Yeah.
Yeah, he always had that.
Yeah, there was always that edge to him. Yeah. Thank you very much for this interesting conversation. I don't really know if there's where to. I'm actually like, I thought I'd go. I'm going to do this a 2-hour conversation, but I already feel like I'm pretty full with information. You just filled my brain there.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I'd like people to know that I have a book out called Science and Lust.
Okay, I didn't find the book, and I'm sorry.
Pretty much says it all. It's I think about 20 essays, which are really just heavily reported essays on scientific studies of sexuality and mating. So Science and Lust can be found, well, in America, it can be found in bookstores and on Amazon, and it can be found at a lot of the international bookseller online sites. And also they can go to Forbes.com and search for my name, Rebecca Coffey, Coffey, and follow me.
Yeah.
You found the book.
I found the book.
Well done.
Yeah. This is actually the German Amazon, just because I'm in Germany, but
yeah.
But that's cool. I'll check that out too. Right on. It's on. I can get it on my Kindle.
Yes, you can get it on your Kindle.
Right on. Rebecca Coffey, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. It's been fun.
It was nice. Yeah. Hang around for after we get offline so we can just say goodbye. I always want to say.
All right, good.
Bye.